Hi. First of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity to share with you our ideas, proposals, concerns, and expectations on the first ministerial meeting of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, which Mexico will be proudly hosting on April the 15th and 16th next year. Mexico is convinced of the importance of advancing the development effectiveness agenda and contributing with it to a broader agenda. For example, achieving the Millennium Development Goals and supporting the post-2015 development agenda. We are now 2 years after Busan. To understand where we are, it is useful to go back a little bit into the past. In 2005, around 100 donors and development countries committed to making aid more effective, agreeing to the Paris Declaration that contained 56 partnership commitments organized around 5 principles to make aid more effective. Ownership, to ensure that partner countries exercise effective leadership over their development policies and strategies, and that they are fully in charge of the formulation and coordination of their own development. No one cares more about their own development than the country responsible for it. Alignment, to guarantee that donors base their overall support on partner countries' national development strategies, institutions, and procedures. Harmonization, so that donor actions are in line with their partners' needs and capacities, making them more transparent and collectively effective. Managing for results, handling resources with a focus on generating value and improving decision-making to maximize impact. Mutual accountability, to make sure that both donors and partners are accountable for development results and evaluate areas of opportunity that can be improved. Targets around the 5 principles were established to be met by donors and partner countries by 2010. The achievement of the Paris Declaration's targets by the development community has not shown the expected results. According to the latest report available on the implementation of aid effectiveness commitments, only 1 out of 13 targets established for 2010, coordinated technical cooperation, has been met. Evidence also shows variation in the direction and pace of progress across donors and partner countries since 2005. Some developing countries have made significant progress in the quality of tools and systems for planning and results management. However, in other indicators, such as donor coordination or on tying aid, less progress has been made. The Marshall Plan can be considered the largest cooperation effort in modern times, and the origin of what we know today as international development cooperation. The objective was to make Europe prosperous again, and not only to eradicate poverty. An estimated $15 billion in economic and technical assistance was allocated to support the recovery of European countries. At current prices, it is reasonable to ask why this is relevant for today's agenda. I believe it is essential to keep things in perspective to recall that the original amount of the Marshall Plan is larger than cooperation today. According to the estimates of the Development Assistance Committee, DAC, cooperation today amounts for $125 billion, while cooperation from the Marshall Plan in today's dollars is estimated in $150 billion. This means that today's ODA is below the amount of cooperation provided more than 60 years ago. Given the financial constraints we currently face, committing and making donor coordination happen is the minimum we should look for. However, it is important to recognize that even when those targets have not been fully achieved, they were a good starting point and the basis for a continuous work towards a more efficient approach for development. In the meantime, non-traditional cooperation players like emerging and other developing countries, civil society organizations, local governments, the private sector, have been gaining an important space in the development cooperation architecture, and new approaches and modalities of cooperation, South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation, have become more common. In Busan, the development community, including these increasingly relevant players, met again, and the forum constituted a big change in many aspects. Building on the commitments made in Paris and later in Accra, in Busan, a more inclusive and broader partnership agreed on shared common principles as the basis for effective development, not aid effectiveness anymore. Ownership by developing countries, focus on results, inclusive development partnerships, and transparency and accountability. The Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation was created to support, at the political level, the implementation of Busan's commitments and a global monitoring framework integrated by 10 indicators and targets for 2015 was adopted to track progress and on the commitments and actions agreed at the forum. One of the main objectives of next year's meeting in Mexico will be precisely to assess where we are in the implementation of the 10 indicators set in Busan. However, even if at this stage we still don't have a full picture of where we are with the assessment, we do not foresee a breakthrough, and in that regard, we need to strengthen our political commitment towards this very important agenda. 2014 seems to be a critical moment for international development cooperation, taking into account the following considerations. First, the process for defining the post-2015 development agenda is underway, based on the evaluation of the successes and weaknesses of the Millennium Development Goals, changing global development needs and priorities. Second, we are experiencing a changing global context where wealth and influence have shifted significantly in the last years, where emerging economies play a more significant role and will happen in the foreseeable future. Third, at the same time, we still face the challenges of slow economic growth in developed economies and its negative impact on official development assistance flows, where they explain 90% of it. Fourth, this context makes it increasingly important to promote an efficient and inclusive development cooperation architecture that integrates multiple and emerging actors as a fundamental pillar for enabling the development agenda. We are fully convinced that the ministerial meeting should insert itself in the larger process to define the international development framework that will replace the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the post-2015 goals will guide the global community on what needs to be achieved in years ahead. The global partnership should be the forum to discuss how these present and future development goals can be achieved by maximizing the impact of the different cooperation modalities and traditions on the ground, identifying the synergies that can be generating among all the different actors involved. Building on our comparative advantages is essential to achieve an enabling international environment for development that also reflects appropriately the new global realities. With this in mind, the agenda for next year's meeting includes 5 topics, having countries from different regions volunteer to lead the work on each one of them. First, a revision of progress since Busan. Second, domestic resource mobilization as the most important component of funding for the cooperation agenda. Third, cooperation with the private sector. Fourth, South-South cooperation and knowledge sharing. Fifth, cooperation with middle-income countries. These topics will be guided by 2 overarching themes: the contribution of the effectiveness process to the post-2015 development agenda, and inclusive development, which we understand both in terms of a more plural participation by a wider range of actors, including a strong involvement of civil society and the private sector, and of the need to promote an overarching inclusion perspective on development policies to ensure that no one is left behind. This is the approach we have followed domestically while redefining our social programs in Mexico. Why middle-income countries? Mexico proposed the inclusion in the agenda of a session on cooperation with middle-income countries, as they have a dual role in international development cooperation, both as recipients and providers. We believe this has to be better understood in order to take advantage of what middle-income countries can actually contribute to this agenda. We also believe that there is a need to review the current country classification system, which results in a country being eligible or not to receive cooperation. Using gross national income per capita as the only indicator to classify a middle-income country does not appropriately explain the reality of the internal development challenges that most middle-income countries still face. This classification limits many countries' ability to be supported in the path towards development, and for some of them, this could be a major problem. You graduate from being poor, and then no one else will help you in becoming more developed. A couple of times in the past months, I have heard that eradicating poverty is a feasible goal by 2030, and there will be no need anymore for development cooperation agencies. It is hard to believe that this is what we expect when we think of development. Development cooperation cannot be limited to poverty eradication alone, and new mechanisms and ideas should be continuously discussed, agreed, and implemented in order to properly address the challenges associated with development that we see in middle-income countries, such as fighting inequality and promoting inclusive development. It is important for countries facing these challenges to find appropriate international support for their efforts in this regard, which do not necessarily entail direct financial flows. Technical assistance, capacity building, training, knowledge sharing, and technology transfer, among many others, are very valuable tools for countries trying to modernize and strengthen their institutions, to promote competitiveness, to facilitate economic activity and trade, to implement best practices for public administration, and to fight corruption, while looking to democratize productivity in order to increase social welfare and reduce income inequality. Of course, this discussion is not intended to increase cooperation flows to middle-income countries at the expense of low-income countries or least developed countries, which rightfully are at the center of international community efforts. The focus of the discussion is rather set on the most effective way to integrate the needs and strengths of middle-income countries in the international development architecture. Middle-income countries are critical drivers of the world economy, with knowledge and resources to share. For instance, middle-income countries played a decisive role in supporting the poorest countries through the latest financial crisis on account of well-developed trade relations and remittances, contributing to about half of the post-crisis recovery of the world economy. For their systemic importance, investing in middle-income countries not only has a direct impact on global development. 73% of the world's poor live in middle-income countries, but can also help build the necessary capabilities for middle-income countries to assume responsibilities within the international cooperation architecture according to their capacities, such as those we see in the South-South traditional and in triangular cooperation projects, promoting development in other middle-income countries and low-income countries. While the focus may vary from country to country, the priorities for cooperation with middle-income countries as a group must be centered on areas such as poverty eradication, governance improvement, reduction of economic and social inequality, greater diversification to reduce vulnerability of trade and external financial shocks, improved capacity for South-South cooperation and technology transfer, and finance to tackle climate change. Growth and stability in middle-income countries means a considerable potential benefit for the rest of the world and works towards global stability and peace. Mexico's dual character puts us in a privileged position to understand different perspectives and concerns, and thus to act as a bridge between different cooperation perceptions and a consensus builder among them. The meeting can be a learning platform on development cooperation that can contribute to design new goals or enabling mechanisms in which accountability for development is addressed. We aim for future meetings of the Global Partnership to become innovative spaces for a dynamic and multi-stakeholder dialogue that results in new and action-oriented ideas. We are exploring ways to promote that the meeting enables creativity and to be as thought-provoking as possible. We are encouraging participants to think outside the box and to engage in innovative manners. We reaffirm our commitment to make this an inclusive and open process, taking fully into account the views and legitimate concerns of all actors, which is why we will ensure that they all have the proper opportunities to externalize their concerns, work on common positions, and display their successful stories. In that regard, we will be working closely with the representatives of civil society and parliamentarian groups to organize their own preparatory meetings, as well as with the private sector, local governments, multilateral organizations, academia, and other actors to launch side events and other networking spaces during this first high-level meeting. We welcome your feedback and comments in all regards. Thank you very much.